There are episodes in my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes so bizarre, so tinged with the shadow of the unnatural, that I long delayed setting them to paper. For even the seasoned eye of a physician is shaken when confronted with the rumor of death defied. It was in the bleak days of winter, when London lay muffled beneath its yellow fog, that a summons reached us at Baker Street, not of robbery nor blackmail, but of a man laid in his grave, whose hand was seen again upon the very door he once called home. What followed drew Holmes and me into a labyrinth where grief became a weapon, where science was bent to fraud, and where the earth itself seemed to yield up the living. This is the case I record as Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Man Who Never Died. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. A Visitor in Mourning. I had found Holmes of a morning in that happy trance which work, tobacco, and silence invariably produced in him. The violin lay mute upon the chair-back, its varnish catching the grey light like amber. A little forest of chemical tubes occupied the table, their contents ranging from the innocent clarity of distilled water to substances whose hues suggested neither health nor legality. And the Persian slipper, that infamous repository of his strongest shag, hung like a gauntlet from the mantel, its toe pointing accusingly at the ceiling, as if in perpetual surrender. Outside, Baker Street steamed with the slow drizzle of a January noon. The pavements gleamed like polished coal, and the dull clink of a handom's trace chain reached us now and again, like a punctual metronome upon which London keeps its time. A coal cart rumbled past, its driver hunched beneath a tarpaulin cape. A flower girl's cry rose and fell. The city breathed its familiar breath of soot, horses, and damp wool, the perfume of our great metropolis in winter. Holmes sat motionless in his dressing gown, his long fingers steepled before his hawk-like nose, his eyes half closed in that state of profound cogitation which I had learned not to disturb. Upon the arm of his chair lay the morning's Times, unread. A blue pencil rested beside it, suggesting he had begun some marginalia and then abandoned the exercise for deeper waters. I knew these moods. They were the doldrums between storms, and I had long since ceased to mistake them for idleness. I was myself engaged in updating my notes upon the curious affair of the Hammersmith Wonder, a case which I hoped one day to chronicle for the public, though its resolution had left certain parties in positions too delicate for immediate publication. The scratch of my pen seemed to harmonize with the rain, and for a time we inhabited that peculiar companionship of men who understand that silence is not absence, but presence refined. Our bell pealed with the energy of extremity. The sound cut through the morning's calm like a knife through gauze. Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stair was swift, and a moment later she admitted a lady in deep mourning. Young still, though with that whiteness of cheek which is the heraldry of sleepless nights. Her veil was thrown back, revealing features of uncommon refinement, though grief had drawn its thumb across them until they seemed almost translucent. She carried a black glove crushed in one hand, as if it were something to be strangled, and her breath came quick and shallow, as one who has walked too far and too fast. Mrs. Eleanor Venn, she announced herself with a low curtsy, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Holmes's eyes had already catalogued her with that unsettling completeness which never failed to disconcert those who did not know him. I saw his gaze flicker from the damp hem, evidence of a hurried walk through the rain-soaked streets, to the fringe of pale clay upon the edge of her skirt, a clay not native to London's darker earth, to the faintest scent of violets rising from her reticule. Ladies' wax, not perfume, I noted, for I had learned to distinguish the two. Her boots, though well made, bore the scuff marks of one who had paced a confined space repeatedly, and her wedding band was twisted slightly upon her finger, as if turned countless times in moments of anxiety. He rose with that grave courtesy which seldom deserted him, bowed, and offered her the fireside chair. I hastened to stir the coals and add a fresh log, for the lady was shivering despite the comparative warmth of our sitting-room. "You will forgive the state of our quarters," said Holmes, sweeping a stack of chemical journals from a side table. "Watson and I have been engaged in certain experiments that leave their mark upon domestic order. But pray be seated, madam, and speak without fear. Whatever has brought you to Baker Street on such a morning, you may be assured of both our discretion and our attention." She settled into the chair as one might settle into a confession box, her spine straight despite her evident distress. For a moment she looked into the fire, gathering herself, and I took the opportunity to study her more closely. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair dressed simply, and a face that must have been handsome before sorrow carved its signatures upon it. Her mourning clothes were of good quality, but not ostentatious. The widow of a gentleman of comfortable means, I judged, rather than wealth. "My husband, Mr. Alistair Venn of Ashfield Lodge, Surrey," she began at last, her voice low but clear, "was buried 3 nights ago." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment, his expression one of sympathetic attention. He had drawn his dressing-gown more closely about him and settled into his chair with the stillness of a cat at a mouse-hole. "And last night," she continued, and here her voice faltered for the first time, "he ascended the front steps at Ashfield, placed his key in the lock, and, though the door was barred within, left upon the brass a smear of ash. I know his keys bite upon the plate, Mr. Holmes. I know the sound it makes. I know his height, his manner of walking, the way he paused always at the 3rd step to shift his weight. I saw him by the coach lamp. The fog was thick, but not so thick as that. Mr. Holmes," and here she raised her eyes to meet his with a directness that spoke of desperate courage, "my husband, who was buried beneath 6 feet of Surrey clay, returned." A lesser man might have smiled. I confess the tale had about it that quality of the penny dreadful which invites scepticism. But Holmes's fingers merely steepled more tightly, and his grey eyes sharpened with interest. "You saw him clearly?" he asked. "As one sees a memory that refuses to fade," she replied. "As one sees a face that has been studied in life and love until every line is known. It was he, Mr. Holmes, or if not he, then something that wore his form with terrible accuracy." "Pray continue," said Holmes. "Tell us of your husband's death, and spare no detail, however trivial it may seem. Watson will take notes, if you permit." I had already drawn forth my notebook, and she nodded her assent. She proceeded then with admirable composure. Mr. Alistair Venn, her husband of 5 years, had been a collector of antiquities and an energetic if eccentric gardener, a combination of passions that had led him to cultivate rare specimens brought from the Levant and Asia Minor, arranged in beds that mimicked ancient temple gardens. He was a man of independent means, scholarly in temperament, vigorous in health, and possessed of that restless curiosity which drives some men to accumulate objects while others accumulate knowledge. In Mr. Venn's case, she said with a sad smile, he had pursued both with equal fervour. 3 nights prior, he had taken port in the library with his stepson, Miles Hartley, her own son from a previous marriage, and their family physician, Dr. Julian Carew. It was their custom on Wednesday evenings, she explained, a masculine ritual from which she was cheerfully excluded. The gentleman had been in good spirits when she retired at 10 o'clock. At 11:30, Miles had summoned her in great agitation. Mr. Venn had collapsed. Dr. Carew, already present, had attended him at once, but pronounced him beyond the reach of earthly skill. The heart, he said, had simply stopped, a sudden cessation not uncommon in men who burned, as Mr. Venn did, with constant intellectual intensity. The death had been sudden, the burial, by Dr. Carew's counsel, swift, and the coffin closed, owing, he said, to contagious mischief in the lungs, a precaution he insisted upon with such medical authority that neither she nor the vicar had questioned it. The funeral had taken place with unseemly haste, attended by a handful of villagers and the immediate household. The coffin had been screwed down in the morning and carried to the family plot by midday, beneath a sky the colour of pewter. And since then, Holmes prompted, his voice gentle but insistent. Mrs. Venn drew from her reticule 3 folded notes, which she laid upon the table with a hand that trembled slightly. These arrived, she said. 1 each morning since the burial. They are in my husband's hand. His unmistakable hand, Mr. Holmes. I would know it among 1,000. Holmes took up the first note and examined it with his lens, holding it close to the window's grey light. I rose to look over his shoulder. The paper was of good quality, cream-laid and watermarked. The writing was indeed distinctive, a scholar's hand, upright and precise, with characteristic flourishes on the capital letters. The message was brief. My dearest E, all is arranged. Do not grieve. Keep courage. I shall return when the hour permits. Destroy this. The note was sealed with a blob of violet wax impressed by a griffin, its wings spread, a saltire beneath its claws. Holmes turned it over, sniffed it delicately, held it to the light, and finally set it down with an expression of deep interest. The second note was similar in tone. Patience, beloved. The matter requires only time. Trust no one. Await my instruction. A V. The third, received that very morning, was more explicit. Attend the garden door at midnight. Come alone. Speak of this to no one. All will be explained. A V. Each bore the same violet wax and griffin seal. Each was undeniably in the hand of a man whose fingers, by all accounts, had been cold and still for 3 days. You obeyed this instruction? Holmes asked. I did, Mr. Holmes. Last night. I wrapped myself in a dark cloak and went to the garden door. It is a side entrance we use for the kitchen yard. The fog was so thick I could scarcely see my own hand. I waited for nearly an hour, but no one came to that door. She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw him at the front entrance. He was standing upon the steps, dressed in his old corduroy coat, the one he wore for gardening. His hat was pulled low. He reached out and tried the door, and though it was locked from within, I heard the key scrape in the lock, and when I ran to look in the morning, there was ash upon the brass plate, smeared by fingers as if someone had touched it without thinking. The ash was there when you examined it, Holmes asked sharply. It was, and is. I have touched nothing. Excellent. And your household, who resides at Ashfield besides yourself? My stepson, Miles Hartley, who is my late first husband's son. He is 24. Mrs. Brant, the housekeeper, has been with the family since Mr. Venn's father's time. There is a cook and a maid of all work, but they sleep in the village. Dr. Carrow calls frequently, as he did even before this tragedy. And Reverend Pritchard, our curate, has been most attentive in our hour of need. Why come to Baker Street? I asked gently, for the question had been troubling me. And not to your local constable. She turned to me with an expression of mingled gratitude and despair. As to the constable, Dr. Watson, I fear for my husband's name. If this is some cruel hoax, I would not have it bruited about the village that the widow Venn sees ghosts in the fog. If it is something worse, if there is some terrible truth behind these manifestations, then I need a man who can unpick mysteries, not one who can only arrest obvious villains. And as to you, she looked back at Holmes. Mr. Sherlock Holmes is not a man to whom the dead are sent as entertainment. Holmes's mouth twitched in what might, in another man, have been a smile. Hardly my line of diversion, madam. I prefer my puzzles to remain on this side of the grave. Your husband's ring. Did he wear one? He did not favour jewellery, save for his watch and key-ring. The key-ring, you mean. May I see it? She drew it from her pocket and held it out. It was a simple brass affair, holding perhaps half a dozen keys of various sizes. Holmes examined it with his lens, turning it this way and that, testing each key with his thumbnail, sniffing at the metal as a wine merchant might sniff a cork. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting indeed. The keys show wear consistent with regular use, but this one, he indicated the largest, has fresh scratches about the bit, as if it had been turned by someone unfamiliar with its mechanism. And here, upon the ring itself, a trace of the same violet wax we see upon your letters. Someone has handled these keys recently, Mrs. Venn, and with some purpose. He returned the ring to her and rose, moving to the window, where he stood, looking out at the rain-swept street. We shall go to Ashfield tonight, Watson. The fog favours us, and there are questions for which I hope your medical sensibilities may provide a tonic. Mrs. Venn's gloved hand unclenched. The glove, I noticed with a physician's eye for detail, bore the faintest dusting of ash along the fingers, as though the wearer had pressed them upon a mantle long uncleaned. It was a trifle, and yet in Baker Street trifles oft opened the hushed doors of larger rooms. Holmes turned back to her. One final question, madam. Your husband's will, has it been read? A flush rose to her pale cheeks. It has not. Dr. Carrow suggested we wait a decent interval. He said the legal formalities could keep until the period of deepest mourning had passed. How thoughtful, said Holmes, and though his tone was mild, I detected in it a note that boded ill for the good doctor's peace of mind. We shall call upon you this evening, Mrs. Venn. In the meantime, burn nothing, touch nothing at the front door, and if another note arrives, handle it by the corners only. Watson will see you to a cab. I escorted the lady down our 17 steps and saw her into a hansom, pressing into her hand one of Holmes's cards upon which I had written our assurance of assistance. She looked up at me from beneath her veil, with eyes that held both hope and dread, a combination I had seen before in those who brought their troubles to 221 B. Baker Street. When I returned, Holmes was pacing before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his brows drawn down in concentration. "Well, Watson?" "A remarkable tale," I said, "though whether it is the work of a clever charlatan or something more sinister, I cannot yet determine." "Nor I," said Holmes, "which makes it all the more worthy of our attention. But certain elements are suggestive. The closed coffin, always a convenience for those who wish to substitute one body for another. The swift burial, before questions can be asked or autopsies demanded. The physician who counsels haste and happens to be present at the death. The stepson who inherits. The notes in a genuine hand, urging the widow to trust no one. And finally, the midnight apparition, dressed in clothes anyone might obtain from a wardrobe, leaving ash upon a door plate as proof of his impossible return." "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect a stage play, Watson, with our widow cast as the audience. Someone wishes her to believe her husband lives. The question is why? To prevent her from examining the will? To keep her from remarrying? To drive her mad and have her declared incompetent?" He paused in his pacing. "Or perhaps simply to keep her quiet about something she might otherwise reveal. But the handwriting is genuine, which means either Mr. Venn wrote those notes before his death, or he is not dead at all." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I rather fancy the latter possibility, though not, I think, in the supernatural sense our client fears." He moved to his desk and drew out a railway timetable, running his finger down the columns. "There is a train at 4:15 that will have us in Surrey by 6. Pack for an overnight stay, Watson, and bring your service revolver. If I am right about this business, we may find ourselves in the company of men who have gone to considerable trouble to maintain an illusion, and such men do not surrender their secrets gladly." I confess a chill followed me to my cloak, for there is something in the human heart which recoils, even in daylight, from the idea of hands that come back from the grave to touch our locks. The rain had intensified, and through our window the street below had become a river of black umbrellas and hunched shoulders, a moving stream of humanity bent against the January cold. Somewhere in that great city, threads were being pulled that reached into a quiet Surrey village, into a churchyard's damp earth, into a widow's broken sleep. Thus, rapt and resolute, we set our course toward Surrey before the lamps were lit, carried by the iron wheels of progress into a mystery that would test even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction. So commenced a business that promised little and delivered shadows. But in those shadows, as I would soon learn, Holmes would find the most tangible of fingerprints, and in the space between death and life, uncover a fraud as audacious as any I had chronicled in all our years together. Chapter 2. Ashfield Lodge and its Shadows. Ashfield Lodge stood where Surrey fields lean inward like confidants, at the end of a lane that wound through bare hedgerows and winter-stripped oaks. The train from London had carried us through the dying light, past stations whose lamps bloomed yellow against the gathering dusk, past villages that huddled around their church spires like chicks beneath a hen. By the time we descended at the local halt, night had fallen, complete, and a mist was rising from the water meadows, thick and white as wool. We engaged a trap at the station, and the driver, a taciturn fellow who seemed disinclined to conversation, took us along roads that grew progressively narrower and more rutted. The horse's breath steamed in the cold air, and the wheels crunched on gravel still wet from the day's rain. On either side, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional light of a cottage window or the white blur of a sheep in a field. It was country England at its most isolate and ancient, and I felt keenly that we were leaving behind the gas-lit certainties of town for something older and less easily explained. The lodge itself announced its presence first by a gravel sweep, then by 2 yews that stood like sentries at the gate, their branches heavy with accumulated moisture. Beyond these loomed a respectable house whose portico had outlived several generations with reluctant dignity. A gentleman's residence of the last century, built of brick now darkened by weather and creeping damp, with mullioned windows that caught our approaching lights like watchful eyes. The lane was sodden, and the hedgerows held beads of moisture like rosaries, each drop a tiny prism in the lamplight. Mrs. Venn herself met us at the door, her face pale but composed in the hallway's candlelight. The interior of Ashfield spoke of comfort declining gently into shabbiness. Good furniture grown worn, carpets faded in the traffic lanes, pictures whose frames wanted gilding. It was the home of a family whose fortune had stabilized at a comfortable sufficiency, and saw no need to press beyond it. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot adequately express my relief at your presence. She took our coats and led us into a drawing-room where a fire burned low in the grate. The household is assembled, as you requested in your telegram. I thought it best to inform them you were consulting on certain legal matters arising from my husband's death. I hope that was appropriate. Quite appropriate, said Holmes. It is often useful to observe people before they know they are being observed for any particular purpose. She introduced us then to the small assembly that awaited in the drawing-room. First came Miles Hartley, her stepson, a handsome young man of perhaps 24 years, with fair hair worn rather longer than was fashionable, and the restless hands of one who is never quite at ease. His collar was new and stiff, suggesting a recent purchase, but his cuff was frayed, and I noticed that his boots, though polished, were worn thin at the heels. He bowed to us with the careful courtesy of a man conscious of his position, but uncertain of his welcome. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, my mother has spoken of you. I confess I am somewhat at a loss as to how legal matters require a consulting detective, but I defer to her judgment in these dark hours. His voice held that peculiar tone of one who wishes to appear more assured than he feels. Mrs. Brant, the housekeeper, was next, a woman of 60 or so, as stiff as her cap and starched as her apron. She possessed that formidable quality of the long-time retainer who regards the family's affairs as her own and newcomers as provisional at best. She curtsied to us with the barest minimum of deference and retired to a straight-backed chair from which she surveyed us with undisguised suspicion. Dr. Julian Carow proved to be a pale, vigilant fellow of perhaps 40 years, with the compelling gentleness of an oft-consulted physician and the tired eyes of one who has sat at many bedsides. He wore well-cut clothes and moved with that quiet authority which medical men acquire through years of commanding attention in sick rooms. His handshake was cool and professional, his smile sympathetic but measured. Gentlemen, I am pleased Mrs. Venn has sought counsel in these difficult days. The loss of a husband is always traumatic, and I confess I have been concerned for her state of mind. Grief can manifest in many forms, some of them, shall we say, alarming to the sufferer. I bristled slightly at the implication, but Holmes merely nodded with apparent agreement. Lastly came the Reverend Pritchard, a curate from the village, who had called, he explained, to be of service in whatever capacity the family might require. He was a thin, nervous man of middle age, with ink-stained fingers and the apologetic manner of one who feels his calling has placed him perpetually in the wrong. He looked, even under our scrutiny, like a man who preferred dim parlours and dusty parish registers to the bright commerce of human fellowship. Holmes, with that friendly tact which offends none and alarms all, took command of the room without appearing to do so. He seated himself near the fire, declined the offer of tea, and in a conversational tone that suggested mere idle curiosity, began to gather the facts. Mrs. Venn has naturally sought legal advice concerning her husband's estate, he began, and certain questions have arisen which require clarification. Perhaps, Dr. Carrow, you might walk us through the events of that final evening. As I understand you were present when Mr. Venn was taken ill. The physician inclined his head. I was, though I wish to God I had not been, or that I had been equipped to do more. Mr. Venn, Mr. Hartley and I were enjoying port in the library, a weekly custom of ours. Mr. Venn was in excellent spirits, discussing his recent acquisition of certain Mesopotamian cylinder seals. He had, if I may say so, a tendency toward enthusiasm in such matters that could be quite infectious. He appeared well, entirely. Robust, even. He poured the third glass himself. I recall that distinctly, as he made some jest about the Portuguese and their superior understanding of climate. He drank, sat back in his chair, and was speaking of his plans for the spring planting, when he simply stopped. Stopped speaking. Stopped everything. His face went slack, his eyes rolled upward, and he slumped forward. Mr. Hartley cried out, and I reached him within seconds. There was no pulse, no breath. I attempted what measures I could, but it was clear almost immediately that he had passed beyond mortal aid. The heart, gentlemen, had simply ceased to beat. I have seen it before in men of intense intellectual energy. The engine that drives them burns too hot and consumes itself. You signed the death certificate? I did. The cause was given as cardiac arrest, which was the medical reality. And you recommended a closed coffin? Here Dr. Carrow's pale face took on a faint colour. I did, and I stand by that recommendation, though I confess it has been questioned. Mr. Venn's symptoms in those final moments suggested to me the possibility of pulmonary involvement, a hemorrhagic condition that can be both unsightly and, in rare cases, contagious. I felt it my duty to spare Mrs. Venn the distress of viewing him in such a state, and to protect the household from any possible infection. Most considerate, murmured Holmes, and the burial was arranged with similar expedition? On my advice, yes. In cases where contagion is suspected, delay serves no purpose, and may pose a risk. Holmes turned to Miles Hartley. Mr. Hartley, your relationship with your stepfather? The young man reddened slightly. Cordially distant, sir, if I am to be honest. Mr. Venn was liberal in principle and precise in practice. He was generous in allowing me to reside here after my mother's remarriage, but he disliked my debts. He made no secret of his disapproval of my expenses, though I confess they were not excessive by the standards of town. And yet you joined him for port each week. He insisted upon it, said it was important that the men of the household maintain certain civilities. I found him interesting enough, when he was not lecturing me upon thrift and the virtues of early rising. And now? Holmes's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. I am heir to his personal effects, Miles returned, a shade too quickly. His books, his collection, his instruments and papers. The estate itself, the house and lands, is settled upon my mother, of course, as is proper. Mr. Venn was scrupulous in such matters. No doubt, said Holmes. He rose and began to drift about the room in that seemingly aimless fashion which I had learned to recognize as anything but. He was a slow tide that reached everywhere without appearing to move, his eyes cataloguing every surface, every object, every telling detail that others might overlook. He paused before a small table bearing a salver of calling cards and examined them with apparent interest. He ran his finger along a bookshelf and studied the dust upon it. He bent to inspect the fender, straightened to regard a portrait, and finally came to rest before the hallway, where the front door was visible through the drawing-room's open doorway. Might we examine the door itself? He asked. Mrs. Venn mentioned a certain mark upon the brass plate, and I confess to a professional interest in such details. We moved as a body into the hall, a procession of curiosity and apprehension. The front door was a heavy oak affair, with a brass plate surrounding the lock, a common enough arrangement in houses of this period. Upon the polished brass there was indeed a pale smear, as if ash had been transferred from dirty fingers. Holmes produced his lens and bent to examine it with minute attention, his nose nearly touching the metal. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, what do you make of this?" I leaned in. The ash was fine and pale, quite unlike the coarser residue of a coal fire. "Cigar ash," I ventured. "Or cigarette. Note the texture. Very fine, almost like powder. And here," he touched it delicately with one finger and brought it to his nose, "a faint perfume of Turkish tobacco. Mrs. Brandt, did Mr. Venn smoke such cigarettes?" The housekeeper drew herself up. "Mr. Venn smoked cigars, sir. Trichinopoly," Holmes supplied. "Just so, sir. Heavy things they were, and I complained of the smell often enough. But he would have none of those modern cigarettes, said they were fit only for ladies and young men who wished to appear French." A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. He bent to the doormat and, from its coarse fibres, teased forth with his pocket-knife a tiny flake of violet wax, no larger than a pin's head. He held it up to the lamp, examined it closely, and wrapped it carefully in a piece of paper which he stowed in his waistcoat pocket. "The garden door Mrs. Venn mentioned. Might we see it?" Mrs. Venn led us through the house to a side entrance that opened onto what was clearly the kitchen yard and service area. The door was more modest than the front entrance, with a simple latch and no decorative brass. Holmes examined it thoroughly, but found nothing of note. He stood for a moment, looking out into the darkness where the garden beds lay invisible beyond the circle of light from our lamp. "Mr. Venn was devoted to his garden?" he asked. "Passionately so," said Mrs. Venn. "He spent hours there, even in winter. He said that to understand ancient civilizations, one must understand the plants they cultivated and the manner in which they arranged them. His beds were laid out according to descriptions in Mesopotamian tablets, or so he claimed. I confess the scholarly aspect was beyond me, but I admired the results." "We must see them by daylight," said Holmes, "but for now, might we inspect Mr. Venn's study? I understand he kept his collection there." The study proved to be a handsome room on the ground floor, lined with calf-bound volumes and the melancholy trophies of a restless curiosity. A glazed case held Mesopotamian cylinder seals arranged on velvet, tiny stone cylinders carved with scenes of gods and kings, their surfaces worn smooth by millennia. A bronze lamp of uncertain provenance stood upon a sideboard. Ancient coins lay under glass. Upon the desk, which was positioned to catch the window's light, there sat a tray of sealing wax and implements, red sticks, black sticks, plain beeswax, and several brass seals whose handles were dark with age and use. Holmes's fingers described a swift, noiseless ballet over drawers and ledgers, opening, examining, closing with a delicacy that suggested he knew precisely what he sought and where he was most likely to find it. He removed a small sheet of paper from the blotter and held it to his nose. "Gum Arabic," he said, "for addressing envelopes. And here, a faint smear, garden loam, mica rich, the sort that glitters faintly when caught by lamplight. Interesting." "Sir," said Dr. Carrow, who had followed us into the study. "Nothing of consequence," Holmes returned, though his eyes suggested otherwise. He turned to the tray of sealing wax and examined each stick carefully. Red, black, natural beeswax, but no violet, I see. And these seals, none of them bears a griffin, unless I am mistaken. "My husband's family seal was a chevron with martlets," said Mrs. Venn. "The griffin is unknown to me." "Yet your letters bore such a seal," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. He opened several drawers with Mrs. Venn's permission, examining their contents with that methodical thoroughness which characterized his every investigation. In one he found correspondence, neatly filed. In another, account books showing the careful management of a modest income. In a third, catalogues from antiquarian dealers in London, Paris, and Constantinople. "Your husband acquired his pieces through dealers?" "Almost exclusively. He corresponded with them extensively. Some of the cylinder seals came with quite elaborate provenances, tablets describing their find spots, scholarly opinions on their dates, that sort of thing." Holmes nodded and closed the final drawer. "I think we have seen enough for the moment. There is one final request I must make, however. I should like to view the grave itself." A silence fell upon the company. Dr. Carrow looked troubled. The Reverend Pritchard fingered his collar. Miles Hartley's face had gone pale. "The grave?" Mrs. Venn's voice was barely above a whisper. "If you please, I understand it may seem macabre, but I assure you it is necessary. The churchyard is nearby." "Just beyond the rise," said Reverend Pritchard nervously. "Perhaps a quarter-mile distant, but at this hour, surely Mourning would be more suitable." "I think not," said Holmes. "Watson and I are accustomed to keeping irregular hours, and the night holds no terrors for us. If someone would be kind enough to provide us with a lantern and directions, we shall trouble you no further this evening." The curate, with evident reluctance, offered to guide us, and within a quarter-hour we found ourselves walking through the mist along a narrow path that wound between bare fields. The churchyard lay beyond a misty rise, its stones like bleached teeth against the dark turf, and as we approached I felt that peculiar oppression which such places exert upon the living imagination, especially when visited by night. The church itself was ancient, Norman at its core, with later additions, a squat tower rising like a fist toward the invisible stars. Around it, generations of the dead lay in varying states of memorial, from grand table tombs whose inscriptions had been worn to illegibility by centuries of rain, to modern headstones whose gilt letters still gleamed when caught by our lamplight. Mr. Venn's grave was easily identified, being the most recent addition to this community of silence. The mound was still fresh, the clay clinging with that tenacity I had known upon battlefields, and the flowers that had been placed upon it at the funeral were already wilting in the cold. A simple headstone had been erected, bearing his name, dates, and the words scholar and gentleman, a modest enough memorial for a life spent in the pursuit of ancient wisdom. Holmes circled it once, twice, his lamp held low, examining the ground with minute attention. He measured with his eye the proximity of a leaning table tomb, perhaps 10 feet distant, whose side showed an irregular fissure, mortared clumsily with what appeared to be relatively fresh pointing. "Who tends this ground?" he asked. "The sexton, Lomas," said the curate, "a capable fellow, though given to drink on occasion." "And that tomb?" Holmes indicated the listing monument. "The Hartwood family, an old county name, now extinct. The tomb dates to the last century and has been in poor repair for many years." "The recent mortar work Retri S. Continue edit suggests otherwise," Holmes observed, running his finger along the fissure. The mortar crumbled slightly at his touch, and he brushed the residue from his hands with a thoughtful expression. "When was this repair undertaken?" "I could not say with certainty," Reverend Pritchard replied, his breath misting in the cold air. "The churchwardens authorized certain works last autumn. Drainage issues, you understand. Water seeps beneath these old monuments and undermines their foundations. But I confess I did not personally supervise every repair." "Who would have that knowledge?" "Lomas, the sexton, as I mentioned. He keeps a ledger of such work, though his entries are somewhat, shall we say, impressionistic in their detail." "We shall speak with Lomas," Holmes replied, "but not until the hour favors quiet conversation. A man who has been drinking is often more forthcoming than one who maintains his guard." He made several measurements with a pocket tape, noted the orientation of the grave relative to the church and the table tomb, and examined the surrounding turf for any sign of disturbance. Finally, he straightened and swept the beam of his lamp across the churchyard, taking in the layout of paths, the arrangement of monuments, and the proximity of the church's various doors. "The vestry entrance is there?" he asked, indicating a low door in the church's north wall. "It is, though it is kept locked, except during services." "And access to the crypt?" The curate shifted uncomfortably. "There is a crypt, certainly, medieval in origin, but it has been sealed these many years. The air below is considered unwholesome, and there have been no interments there, within living memory." "I see." Holmes stood for a moment in contemplation, the lamp making strange shadows of his aquiline features. Around us the mist pressed close, muffling sound and reducing the world to a small circle of uncertain visibility. I felt acutely the weight of the dead beneath our feet, generations upon generations returning to the clay from which they had been formed. "Thank you, Reverend Pritchard," Holmes said at last. "You have been most helpful. Watson and I will return to the village inn now. We are fatigued from our journey, and morning will bring, I hope, clearer light on several matters." We walked back to Ashfield Lodge in relative silence, returned the lamp, and made our farewells. Mrs. Venn pressed my hand in gratitude, her eyes searching Holmes's face for some sign of hope or understanding. "Tomorrow, madam," he said gently. These tangles are often clearer when approached fresh. Try to rest, and remember, touch nothing. Admit no one to your husband's study without my knowledge, and if another note arrives, send word to us at once. The village inn, the King's Arms, was a comfortable enough establishment, with low beams, uneven floors, and that particular smell of beer, tobacco, and old wood that characterizes English country hostelries. The landlord, a jovial fellow, with the broken veins of his trade upon his nose, showed us to a pair of clean rooms under the eaves, and brought up cold meat, bread, and a bottle of tolerable claret. Only when we were alone did Holmes break his trance of contemplation. He stood at the small window, looking out upon the village street, where a single lamp burned through the mist, and spoke without turning. Watson, if a man writes from the grave, his pen is either in a conspirator's hand, or there is a tunnel from the vault to the desk. I shall take the liberty of testing both hypotheses before morning. You believe Venn lives? I believe someone wishes us to think so, which amounts to nearly the same thing. The closed coffin, the hasty burial, the physician's convenient concerns about contagion, these are the elements of a stage illusion, Watson. They direct our attention to one hand while the other performs the trick. But every illusion has its mechanism, and every mechanism leaves traces. The ash on the door, the violet wax, are evidence, yes, but of what? That Venn returned from the dead? Or that someone with access to his keys, his wardrobe, and his writing desk wishes to create that impression? Consider. The ash is too fine to be from his usual cigars. The wax bears a seal not found in his study. The handwriting is genuine, but the paper, did you notice, is fresher than that in his desk drawer, and the ink, while matching in color, has a slightly different viscosity. Small details, but suggestive. You think the notes were written before his death, or by him under duress. There is a third possibility, of course, that he wrote them willingly, as part of some scheme of his own. Men have faked their deaths before, Watson, for reasons ranging from bankruptcy to blackmail. But in this case, I think not. The fear in Mrs. Venn's eyes was genuine, and a man who truly wished to disappear would not send notes that might expose him. No, someone is pulling strings, and our task is to discover who holds them and why. He turned from the window and began to pace the narrow confines of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Tomorrow we must speak with this Sexton Lomas. We must examine the garden and the shed where Venn kept his tools. We must discover who has access to the house at night, and who might have reason to keep Mrs. Venn in a state of anxious suspension. Above all, we must determine what was in that coffin, for I would stake my reputation that it was not Alistair Venn. You mean to open the grave? I asked, feeling a chill despite the room's warmth. If necessary. But first, I think, a little reconnaissance. The night is not yet old, Watson, and fog is the detective's friend. I intend to revisit that churchyard and examine that table tomb more closely. The fissure was recent, the mortar fresh, and if my suspicions are correct, it conceals something more than the bones of the defunct Hartwoods. You don't mean to go alone? I do not. Your company has seen me through darker ventures than this, but I suggest you bring your revolver and dress warmly. The mist is thick, and we may be some time in the cold. I had learned not to press him when the scent had seized him, and I confess that despite my apprehension, or perhaps because of it, I felt that familiar surge of energy that always accompanied our investigations. Here was mystery in its purest form. A dead man walking, a widow's terror, and somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary grief and ordinary death, a mechanism of deception waiting to be exposed. We descended quietly, nodded to the landlord who was dozing by his fire, and slipped out into the mist-shrouded street. The village was silent save for the distant bark of a dog and the creak of an inn sign moving in the slight breeze. We made our way by lamplight and memory back along the path to the churchyard, two shadows among shadows, and as we approached, I confess that the notion of footsteps upon fresh clay stood at the foot of my consciousness like an unwelcome sentinel, refusing to be dismissed by reason or daylight's distant promise. The dead, I reminded myself, do not walk, but men who wish us to believe they do can be far more dangerous than any ghost. Chapter 3. Red Herrings by Lamplight. Holmes vanished at 9 o'clock the following morning, and did not reappear until nearly noon. I had breakfasted alone, read the previous day's newspapers that the landlord kept for his guests, and spent a restless hour walking the village lanes, observing the quiet commerce of rural life. A carter delivering coal, women with baskets returning from the baker, children driving geese along the verge. It was England at its most prosaic and peaceful, yet I found myself studying shadows and starting at sudden sounds, my mind still occupied with the previous night's expedition. For Holmes had indeed examined that table tomb by the uncertain light of our dark lantern, and what he had found, or rather what he had suspected, had left him grimly satisfied. The fissure, when probed more deeply, revealed not merely a crack in the masonry, but an intentional opening, roughly a foot square, that appeared to penetrate into the monument's interior. The mortar that sealed it was indeed fresh, applied within the past few weeks, if Holmes's assessment of its cure was accurate. More tellingly, the ground immediately before the tomb showed signs of disturbance, not the random settling of earth, but the systematic disruption of turf that had been lifted, trodden upon, and imperfectly replaced. "Someone has been entering or exiting through this monument," Holmes had whispered, his breath white in the frigid air. "The question is whether they have been going in or coming out, and whether their journeys have anything to do with the grave of Alistair Venn." We had not attempted to force the opening. That would require tools and time, and the risk of discovery was too great. But Holmes had made careful measurements and taken samples of the mortar, which he now carried in various envelopes and vials, carefully labelled in his precise hand. When he finally returned to the inn, he entered with the draught of the corridor clinging to him, a sprinkle of lime upon his sleeve, and that particular expression of satisfaction that indicated progress. "The sexton," he announced, dropping into a chair and accepting the whisky I poured for him, "keeps poor records and a better whisky." "We are friends." He told me then, in fuller detail, that he had located Lomas in his cottage near the Lich Gate, a weathered man of 60, with the rheumy eyes and uncertain hands of one who has long sought comfort in the bottle. A half-sovereign and a sympathetic ear had loosened his tongue considerably, and he had spoken with surprising candour about the churchyard's recent activities. The repairs to the Heartwood tomb had been authorised, Lomas confirmed, but not by the churchwardens, rather by a private individual who had claimed kinship with the defunct family, and expressed concern about the monument's deterioration. This individual had paid handsomely for the work and had insisted it be done quickly and with minimal fuss. The sexton, whose income depended upon such gratuities, had asked few questions. "Did he describe this benefactor?" I asked. "Only in the vaguest terms. A gentleman, well-spoken, with a medical man's hands. He thought perhaps it was Dr. Carow, but could not swear to it. The transaction was conducted largely in shadow, and Lomas's memory, pickled as it is, retains only impressions." "Carow!" I exclaimed. "But why would he concern himself with an old tomb?" Why indeed, unless the tomb's condition was of less interest to him than its accessibility. Holmes swirled his whisky thoughtfully. Lomas also mentioned that he has seen lights in the churchyard at night, lanterns moving among the stones well past midnight. He assumed they were poachers cutting through the grounds, or perhaps lovers seeking privacy. He did not investigate, being, as he put it, a man who minds his own business and expects others to do likewise. When were these lights observed? Frequently over the past month, but most particularly in the 3 nights following Ven's burial. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And here is the most suggestive detail. Within the church's floor, near the vestry, there are fresh scoring marks, as though a weight had been dragged at night. The stone flags show scraping that was not there at Christmas, according to Lomas, who cleans the church weekly. No one has confessed to such enterprise, and the vicar himself seems unaware of it. You suspect a passage? From the church to the tomb? Or from the tomb to somewhere else entirely? Medieval churches often had such tunnels for the movement of valuables during times of unrest, or as escape routes for priests during periods of persecution. Many have been sealed and forgotten. But if one knew of such a passage, and if one had reason to use it. He left the thought unfinished, but its implications were clear enough. A man who wished to move unseen might find a medieval tunnel more serviceable than any modern convenience. By noon we had returned to Ashfield Lodge, where the household received us with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Mrs. Ven looked as though she had not slept. Her eyes were shadowed, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. Miles Hartley paced the drawing-room with barely suppressed agitation. Even Mrs. Brant, that monument of domestic propriety, seemed less firmly anchored than before. Holmes asked casually whether the household received many callers. "Only the Reverend Pritchard," said Mrs. Ven, "and Dr. Carow, of course. They have been most attentive since my loss. Mr. Hartley's friends keep to town, and we are not a family much given to society." "Mr. Hartley smokes, I think," Holmes suggested, his tone conversational. Miles, who had just entered from the hallway, lifted his chin with something between defiance and defensiveness. "As a gentleman, may." "Turkish?" "From time to time. I find them less heavy than cigars, though my stepfather—" He caught himself. "Though Mr. Ven disapproved of them. He said they were an affectation. And Dr. Carow? Does he smoke?" "Rarely. He is conscious of his duties to his patients and avoids habits that might compromise his health or his reputation." Holmes merely smiled, that slight upward curve of the lips that revealed nothing and suggested everything. "I wonder if I might impose upon your kindness once more, Mrs. Ven. I should like to see Mr. Ven's wardrobe and outdoor things. Sometimes a man's clothes tell us more about his life than any document." She led us upstairs to the master bedroom, a spacious chamber overlooking the garden, where a wardrobe of dark oak stood against one wall. Within hung the usual complement of a gentleman's attire: morning coats, evening dress, country tweeds, all of good quality, but not excessive. Holmes examined each garment with care, checking pockets, studying buttons, even sniffing at lapels with that extraordinary nose of his that could detect a perfume in a crowded ballroom or tobacco ash on a windy heath. And his outdoor things? For the garden? In the shed at the back of the house. He kept them there to avoid tracking soil indoors. Mrs. Brandt insisted upon it. The garden shed proved to be a structure of weathered planks and a pitched roof of slate, situated at the far end of the kitchen garden, where the beds gave way to a small orchard of ancient apple trees. Within, it held the usual impedimenta of the enthusiastic gardener: spades, forks, rakes, coils of twine, terracotta pots stacked like a clay village, and sacks of various composts and amendments that filled the air with the rich smell of peat and manure. Upon a peg hung a rough corduroy coat, its fabric worn smooth at the elbows and along the back where a basket might have rested. Holmes lifted it down and examined it with minute attention. The right cuff, I now observed, bore a distinct scorch mark, as though it had kissed a lamp's chimney or come too close to a candle flame. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. A careful man in most respects, yet careless with fire. Beneath the coat stood a pair of stout gardening boots, their leather cracked with age and use, their soles thick with dried mud that bore the telltale glitter of mica when caught by the light from the shed's small window. Holmes picked up one boot and examined its heel with his lens. "What do you make of that, Watson?" I looked closely. The heel had been repaired. That much was obvious from the newer rubber that had been affixed to the worn leather. But the repair was distinctly odd. The rubber had been set askew, angling inward rather than flush with the boot's original sole. "A careless cobbler," I suggested. "A careless impostor, more likely," Holmes murmured, so quietly I almost missed it. "A man not accustomed to another's boots may dress a limp upon himself by error." "File that away." He replaced the boot and turned his attention to the shed's other contents. Upon a shelf near the window lay various garden tools, a ball of twine, several packets of seeds, and, this caught Holmes's eye immediately, a tin of sealing wax. He opened it and held it to the light. The wax within was violet. "Well, well," he said softly. Beside the tin lay a small brass seal, tarnished with age, but still clearly showing its device. A griffin rampant with a saltire beneath its claws. "The very seal from our mysterious letters," I breathed. "Indeed, and carelessly left where anyone might find it, which suggests either supreme confidence or hasty concealment." He wrapped both items carefully in his handkerchief and pocketed them. "Mrs. Venn, these objects, had you seen them before?" She shook her head, her face pale. "Never. My husband's sealing wax was kept in his study, and he used only his family seal. I cannot imagine what these are doing here." "Can you not?" Holmes's voice was gentle but probing. "Think carefully, madam. Who has access to this shed?" "Anyone in the household, I suppose. It is never locked. The garden staff, though they come only twice weekly now. Mr. Hartley, occasionally, when he chooses to interest himself in the grounds, and Dr. Carrow has been known to walk in the garden while waiting for his carriage. And at night. At night it would be dark and isolated. One would need a lantern." "Precisely." Holmes moved about the shed with that peculiar gliding motion of his, examining walls, floor, and ceiling with equal attention. He tapped the planks, pressed against joints, and finally paused at the rear wall where several sacks of potting soil were stacked. "Help me move these, Watson." Together we shifted the heavy sacks, and as we did so, I felt it, a draught of cold air along the shed's plank wall, slight but unmistakable. Holmes's hand ran over the wood and halted at what appeared to be a large knot. He pressed it firmly. With a reluctant sigh, as though the wood itself protested this revelation, a section of the wall, perhaps 3 feet square, swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow blackness that smelled of earth and lamp oil. Mrs. Venn gasped. "Good God! I had no idea." "Few would," said Holmes, peering into the darkness. "This was cleverly done, and recently too. See how the hinges are oiled. This is no medieval remnant, but a modern addition, cut through the shed's wall and concealed with considerable skill." He struck a match and held it into the opening. The flame revealed a passage, low and narrow, descending by rough steps into darkness. "We must explore it," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Watson, fetch our lantern from the house. Mrs. Venn, I must ask you to return indoors and say nothing of this to anyone. Not to Mr. Hartley, not to Dr. Carrow, not even to Mrs. Brant." "Can you do that?" She nodded mutely, her hand pressed to her throat. Within minutes I had returned with our dark lantern, and Holmes and I stood at the threshold of that secret way. He turned to me with a grim smile. "Once more into the breach, old friend. And this time, I think, we shall find what we have been seeking." We entered single file, stooping beneath the low ceiling, our lantern casting wild shadows on walls of packed earth shored up with timber. The passage was perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, enough for a man to move through if he bent double, but hardly comfortable. It smelled of damp and decay, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. We followed it for perhaps 50 yards. It was difficult to judge distance in such confines, as it sloped downward and then levelled off. The walls here showed marks of recent excavation, and I realized with a chill that this passage had been enlarged, probably within the past few months. The original tunnel, for tunnel it clearly was, had been smaller, perhaps an old drainage culvert or the remnant of some forgotten structure. But someone had expanded it systematically, shoring it up as they went. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of stooped walking through the pressing darkness, we came to a wooden door, stout and new, barred from our side with a heavy timber. Holmes lifted the bar carefully and pulled the door open. The space beyond was a small chamber, perhaps 8 feet square, cut from the earth and supported by brick pillars that suggested we were beneath some structure. The church, I thought, or one of the old monuments. Within this chamber, lit dimly by our lantern, we saw a crate that served as a seat, a bucket, a folded blanket, and upon a crude shelf, a few books and a bottle of water. And upon the crate, staring at us with hollow eyes and a beard grown wild, sat a man I recognized instantly from the portrait in the study at Ashfield Lodge, Alistair Venn himself. He blinked at the light, then at us, and I saw in his face a mixture of hope, fear, and exhausted resignation. His clothes were the same gentleman's attire he must have worn on the night of his supposed death, but they were now filthy and creased. His hands shook slightly, and I noted with my physician's eye the signs of poor nutrition and possible drugging. the dilated pupils, the slight tremor, the uncertain movements. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Then the play is over." Holmes bowed, and I saw in his face that rare expression of genuine compassion that he reserved for those who had suffered through no fault of their own. "Only the final act remains, sir." "You are Mr. Alistair Venn?" "I am. Or I was. I hardly know any more, which is true." "You are very much yourself, and very much alive," said Holmes firmly, "and you have, I think, a tale to tell. But first, Watson, examine him. I want to know his condition." I stepped forward and conducted a brief examination by lantern light. Venn's pulse was weak but regular, his breathing shallow. His skin was cold and clammy, and he showed signs of dehydration and malnutrition. Most tellingly, his pupils responded sluggishly to light, and there was about his breath that faint, sweet odor I associated with chloral hydrate or one of the opiates. "He's been drugged," I reported. "Regularly, by the look of it. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but he needs proper food, water, and rest, and an end to whatever medication he's been given." "Can he walk?" "With assistance, yes." Holmes nodded. "Then let us remove him from this place. Mr. Venn, can you tell us briefly, very briefly, how you came to be here?" Venn drew a shuddering breath and began to speak, his voice gaining strength as he went. He told us, with a grim composure born of long rehearsal in the darkness, that he had been persuaded by Dr. Carrow and Miles Hartley to go to ground for your safety, they had said, while they settled matters regarding a threatened claim upon his collection by a foreign dealer who insisted that certain of Venn's cylinder seals had been stolen from a private collection in Constantinople. The claim was spurious, Venn insisted, but the dealer had threatened legal action and scandal. Dr. Carrow had proposed a stratagem. Venn would fake his death, thereby removing himself as a legal target while the matter was resolved quietly through intermediaries. The closed coffin and hasty burial had been represented as necessary illusions to throw off the creditors. A body would be procured. There were always unclaimed corpses at the hospitals, Carrow had said, and masked to resemble Venn sufficiently to pass a cursory inspection. Venn himself would hide in this chamber, which Carrow had claimed to know about from his attendance on Venn's father years before, during the old man's final illness. "I was a fool," Venn said bitterly. "I believed them. I signed papers, letters to my wife, instructions for my affairs, thinking they would be used to reassure her that all was a temporary expedient. But once I was here, once the funeral had taken place, everything changed. The bar was lifted only at night, when Miles or Carrow, I was never certain which, would bring me food and water. They dressed me in my garden clothes and led me, muffled and half-drugged, to make appearances at the house. They said it was to reassure Eleanor that I lived, to keep her from making inquiries. But they gave me no chance to speak with her, no opportunity to explain." "Did they ask you to sign documents?" "Repeatedly. Transfers of the collection to a trust they claimed would protect it from seizure. I refused. Something in their manner alarmed me, even through the haze of whatever drug they were administering. After my third refusal, the visits became less frequent, the food more sparse. I think," his voice broke, "I think they were trying to decide what to do with me." "You were to be the man who never died," Holmes said quietly. "A ghost to haunt your widow into compliance, a rumor to keep the village talking, and finally, perhaps, a convenient corpse discovered too late for questions. Venn nodded miserably. I have been such a fool. You have been the victim of clever and ruthless men, Holmes corrected, but that ends now. Watson, help him up. We shall take him back through the passage to the shed, and from there to the village inn, where he can be properly cared for. Mr. Venn, I must ask you to remain silent about your rescue until I give the word. Can you do that? I can do anything that will see justice done, Venn replied, with something of his old spirit returning to his eyes. We helped him to his feet and guided him back through that oppressive tunnel, moving slowly to accommodate his weakness. The journey seemed longer on the return, and I was profoundly relieved when we finally emerged into the shed's dusty light. Holmes carefully closed the secret panel and replaced the sacks precisely as they had been. No one must know we have been here, he said. The trap is set, but it will not spring if our quarry suspects. Mr. Venn, you will stay with us at the inn, in Watson's room. Watson, you will claim to be treating him for nervous exhaustion, which is near enough the truth. We shall keep him concealed until the moment comes for revelation. Thus we smuggled Alistair Venn out of his own property and back to the King's Arms, where the landlord, well-paid and incurious, provided a back room and asked no questions. I attended to Venn's immediate needs, clean water, simple food, and rest, while Holmes sat by the window, smoking pipe after pipe, his eyes distant with calculation. It was a day of half-truths and careful misdirection, and when evening came, Holmes announced that we would return to Ashfield Lodge for dinner at Mrs. Venn's invitation. Tonight, he said, we lay in wait near the garden door, as Mrs. Venn did before. If I am right, our phantom will appear again, for the performance is not yet complete, and actors must take their final bows. The theatre, then, was built, the actors cast, and the audience, chiefly one brave lady, brought to the right pitch of belief. What remained was to cut the leading strings and show the puppeteer at the board, and in so doing demonstrate once again that the most dangerous spectres are not those that walk from graves, but those that walk from the dark corners of human ambition and greed. Chapter 4. The Door in the Earth. The fog that descended upon Surrey that evening was of a quality peculiar to that season, and that landscape, thick as wool, white as milk, and so absolute in its obliteration of distance that one might have believed the world had contracted to a sphere of perhaps 10 feet radius, beyond which nothing existed save uncertain shadows and muffled sound. It was a fog from which phantom coaches might emerge in Gothic novels, through which lost travellers might wander until morning revealed them frozen by unfamiliar gates. It was, in short, precisely the sort of fog that would serve our purposes admirably. We had dined at Ashfield Lodge, a subdued affair at which Mrs. Venn played the gracious hostess, despite her evident anxiety. Miles Hartley picked at his food and drank too much wine, and Dr. Caro maintained a flow of soothing professional conversation that seemed designed to fill every silence before it could become uncomfortable. The Reverend Pritchard had joined us, fluttering at the edges of conversation like a moth at a lamp, contributing little but his nervous presence. Holmes had been at his most charming and least informative, praising the meal, admiring the house, and making occasional observations about the weather, the roads, the state of agriculture in Surrey. Everything, in short, except the matter that had brought us there. I watched our companions closely and saw in their eyes varying degrees of wariness. They knew we were not simply paying a social call, but none could determine precisely what we sought. After dinner, Holmes drew Mrs. Venn aside and spoke to her in low tones. I saw her nod, once, twice, and then her hand flew to her mouth in a gesture of suppressed emotion. When she returned to the drawing-room, her composure was remarkable, though I noted a new brightness in her eyes, the brightness of hope struggling against disbelief. At Holmes's insistence, we withdrew at 10 o'clock, making our farewells with promises to call again the following day. But we did not return to the inn. Instead, guided by Holmes's earlier reconnaissance, we made our way through the fog-shrouded garden to a position among the gnarled apple trees of the orchard, where we had clear sight of both the garden door and the path that led from the shed. The night was bitterly cold. The fog hung motionless, and within its white blanket, every sound was both muffled and magnified. The drip of moisture from bare branches, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of settling timber from the house. We stood like sentinels, wrapped in our greatcoats, hardly daring to breathe lest we miss some crucial sound. Holmes had positioned himself with his back against an apple tree, his dark lantern shuttered and ready, his entire being focused upon the waiting. I knew this mood of his, the hunter's patience that could hold him motionless for hours if necessary. I tried to emulate it, though my feet grew numb and my nose ran in the cold. At 11, the house lights began to go out one by one. At past, silence descended complete. At midnight, I checked my watch by shielding its face and striking a match. The performance began. A shape loomed up the path from the direction of the shed, materializing from the fog like a manifestation from the spirit world. It was tall and muffled, dressed in a rough coat and low-pulled hat, moving with the deliberate care of one who navigates by memory rather than sight. The figure paused at the garden door, raised a hand, and pressed it against the panel as one who seeks the warmth of a remembered entrance. Then it turned, not to the door, but toward the front of the house, and began to move along the side path. Holmes was after it instantly. A greyhound slipped from the leash. I followed as quickly as I could, my feet finding uncertain purchase on the slick grass. The figure heard us, turned, and for a moment I saw beneath the hat's brim a face white with shock. Then it bolted, running with the desperate speed of the discovered, making for the kitchen garden where the vegetable beds humped like small graves in the fog. "Stop!" Holmes's voice rang out. "There is no escape." But the figure did not stop. It dodged between the beds, making for the shed with obvious intent. Holmes put on a burst of speed that I couldn't match, and I heard, rather than saw, the struggle. A cry, the sound of bodies colliding, a grunt of effort. By the time I reached them, Holmes had the figure pinned against the shed's wall, one arm twisted behind its back, the hat knocked askew to reveal the pale, frightened face of Miles Hartley. "Mr. Hartley," said Holmes, not even breathing hard. Or should I say the late Mr. Venn? The performance was convincing, but the costume wants accuracy. Miles struggled briefly, then went limp. "Let me go," he said, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. I was forced." "Were you?" Holmes released him, but maintained his grip on the young man's arm. "Let us discuss the matter inside, shall we? I think there are others who should hear your explanations." He propelled Miles towards the house, and I followed, my mind reeling. So it had been Miles all along, playing the ghost of his stepfather. But to what end, and under whose direction? We entered through the garden door, which Holmes opened with a key he had obtained earlier from Mrs. Venn. The household, roused by our commotion, came streaming down. Mrs. Venn in her dressing gown, Mrs. Brant with her hair in papers, and Dr. Carrow fully dressed, as though he had not yet retired. "What is the meaning of this?" the doctor demanded, his professional composure slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "The meaning," said Holmes, "is that we have caught your accomplice in the act of perpetuating a fraud. Mr. Hartley has been kind enough to impersonate his dead stepfather for our benefit, or rather, for yours. Shall we retire to the study? I think it is time for a full accounting." The atmosphere in that room was charged with such tension that I half expected lightning to manifest. Mrs. Venn sat by the hearth, her hands quiet in her lap, but her eyes burning. Miles stood shamefaced near the door, still wearing the corduroy coat we had found in the shed. Dr. Carrow had assumed a position by the window, his face unreadable, but his body tense as a coiled spring. Mrs. Brant and the Reverend Pritchard, summoned from his late devotions in the village, completed the assembly. Holmes stood before the fireplace and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have tonight witnessed the final act of an elaborate deception, one that required planning, nerve, and a certain ruthless disregard for the suffering of others. But before I explain the mechanism of this fraud, I must first restore to you someone who has been most cruelly wronged." He moved to the door and opened it. I had positioned myself there, and at his signal I helped Alistair Venn into the room. The effect was electric. Mrs. Venn gave a cry that seemed torn from her very soul and rose to her feet. Miles turned white and began to tremble. Dr. Carrow's face, retries continue edit, became a mask of stone. Mrs. Brant dropped her candle, which I hastened to retrieve before it could ignite the carpet, and the Reverend Pritchard fell to his knees, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply shock rendered inarticulate. "Alistair," Mrs. Venn crossed the room in 3 swift steps and caught her husband in her arms. I will not record the words that passed between them, for they were private utterances meant for no ears but their own. I turned discreetly aside, as did Holmes, allowing them this moment of reunion after days that must have seemed to each of them like years. When the first shock had passed, and Venn had been settled into a chair with a glass of brandy pressed into his shaking hands, my friend resumed his exposition. His voice was measured, calm, but beneath it I detected that note of controlled anger that he reserved for those whose crimes struck him as particularly contemptible. "Mr. Alistair Venn was not in his coffin," Holmes began. "A body was procured. Note the hospital linen, the demonstration suture on the forearm, visible even through the wax mask that was applied to give it superficial resemblance to the deceased. From the family vault a passage runs, poorly concealed in the heartwood tomb, connecting to a medieval tunnel system beneath the church. This tunnel has been known to certain parties for some time, but was recently expanded and improved to serve a specific purpose. A second branch of this tunnel system, excavated within the past 3 months, I judge from the freshness of the timber supports, connects to the garden shed at Ashfield Lodge. By that route, Mr. Venn was confined in an underground chamber and led forth at midnight to lay a smear of ash upon the brass doorplate to be glimpsed in the fog by his vigilant wife, and then returned to his cell like a puppet whose strings are carefully managed. He paused, allowing his words to settle upon the assembled company like snow upon a winter landscape. The purpose was twofold. First, to preserve the fiction of death for the outside world, thereby removing Mr. Venn from legal proceedings regarding his collection of antiquities. Second, to unsettle Mrs. Venn to the point where she would sign transfers relating to those same antiquities, specifically to a set of Mesopotamian cylinder seals which certain gentlemen desired to place beyond the reach of any legal claim, and more importantly, to convert into ready cash through sale to private collectors. He looked directly at Dr. Carrow. The foreign dealer who supposedly threatened legal action, did he exist, Doctor? Or was he a fiction designed to frighten Mr. Venn into compliance? The physician's jaw worked, but no words emerged. His silence was answer enough. Holmes continued. The scheme required several elements: a complicit physician who could sign a false death certificate and counsel against an open coffin viewing, a stepson with access to the house and grounds, possessed of sufficient financial desperation to overcome moral scruples, a means of confinement unknown to the victim until too late, and finally, a series of staged appearances calculated to keep Mrs. Venn in a state of anxious suspension, uncertain whether to grieve or hope, too frightened to consult the authorities, and ultimately prepared to sign anything that might resolve her terrible uncertainty. He moved to the desk and gestured toward the tray of sealing wax. The violet wax with griffin seal. It was purchased from a London stationer, was it not? A duplicate made to lend authenticity to forged letters. But a duplicate, cheap and convincing, now lies in the garden shed, mister. Hartley, along with your Turkish cigarettes. Miles flinched as though struck. I never meant. It wasn't supposed to. It wasn't supposed to become imprisonment. Holmes's voice was sharp as a scalpel. What did you imagine it would become? A harmless prank? You changed from cigars to Turkish cigarettes in town this last month, perhaps as an affectation, perhaps to distinguish yourself from your stepfather's habits. But the ash those cigarettes leave is distinctive, fine and pale, quite unlike the coarser residue of Trichinopoly cigars. When you played ghost at the doorstep, wearing your stepfather's coat and boots, you touched the brass plate without thinking. A natural gesture, but one that betrayed you. The ash upon your fingers transferred to the metal. He turned to examine Miles more fully. You repaired one boot heel ill, so that when you dressed in your stepfather's gardening boots, the night you first played ghost, you gave yourself a limp he never owned. The cobbler set the rubber askew, angling it inward. A small error, but one that changed your gait. I observed the marks in the garden path. Uneven pressure, a slight drag of the left foot. Your stepfather walked evenly all his life. You, in his boots, walked like a man with one leg shorter than the other. Miles sagged against the doorframe, all fight draining from him, like water from a punctured vessel. Holmes picked up a small envelope from the desk and held it to the light. The mica upon your boot soles, lifted from the churchyard path when you and Dr. Carrow enlarged the tunnel entrance through the Heartwood tomb, clung still in the shed, mingled with the garden soil. Mica of that particular type exists in the churchyard, but nowhere at Ashfield Lodge. I tested samples this morning. The match is exact. He returned his attention to Dr. Carrow. Your debts, Doctor, numerous and newly pressed, gave you motive. Your medical knowledge provided means. Your position as family physician gave you access and credibility. It was you who counselled Mrs. Venn against an open coffin. You who signed the death certificate without proper examination of the body. You who knew of the tunnel system from your attendance on Mr. Venn's father years ago, when the old man, in his final delirium, spoke of the priest's holes and secret ways beneath the church. You who obtained the substitute corpse from hospital contacts, masked it with mortician's wax, and arranged for its hasty interment. And you, finally, who administered the nightly drafts to keep Mr. Venn tractable during his imprisonment. Dr. Carrow's face had crumpled like paper in a flame. The professional mask, maintained so carefully, dissolved to reveal a man suddenly aged, suddenly defeated. I meant no lasting harm, he said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. Only to borrow against the collection, to resolve my own financial difficulties and repay before anyone noticed. The cylinder seals alone would have fetched enough to clear my debts twice over. I thought Mrs. Venn would sign when sufficiently frightened, and then all could be restored without permanent damage. Without permanent damage? Holmes's voice was cold. You imprisoned a man, Doctor. You drugged him, confined him in darkness, and used him as a puppet to torment his wife. You forged his hand. No, I correct myself. You coerced him into writing letters under duress, letters you then used to manipulate a grieving woman. You conspired to steal property of considerable scholarly and monetary value. And you did all this while wearing the mantle of a healer, a position of trust that makes your betrayal all the more contemptible. The letters were written before the burial, Venn interjected, his voice stronger now. Carrow told me they were to reassure Eleanor, to explain the temporary nature of my concealment. I believed him. God help me, I trusted him. He had attended my father, had been a friend to this family. I never imagined. His voice trailed off into silence, heavy with betrayal. Holmes turned to Miles Hartley. And you, sir? What was your role beyond mere puppetry? Miles had been weeping silently, tears tracking through the ash and grime on his face. I was to inherit the collection, he said brokenly. Carrow said if we could prove the foreign dealer's claim was fraudulent, which it was, he insisted, then the collection would be secured and its value preserved. He said my stepfather's temporary disappearance would protect him from legal consequences, and that I would eventually inherit anyway. So what harm could there be in advancing the timeline slightly? My debts were pressing, Mr. Holmes. I had borrowed from moneylenders at ruinous rates. I was desperate. Desperation does not excuse villainy, said Holmes, but I grant you this. You wavered. You lacked the stomach for what Dr. Carrow ultimately intended. When your stepfather refused to sign the transfer documents, when he began to understand the true nature of his imprisonment, it was Carrow who increased the frequency of the drugging. Carrow who began to speak of permanent solutions. Carrow who frightened you with talk of complicity and mutual ruin. You were his cat's paw, Mr. Hartley, feckless, greedy, weak, but not, I think, fundamentally murderous. Not yet, anyway, though you were travelling that road with increasing speed. He moved to stand before the Reverend Pritchard, who had risen from his knees and now stood trembling by the bookshelf. And you, Reverend, what was your part in this business? The curate's face worked with emotion. Nothing. I swear it. I knew nothing of any plot. My only sin was credulity, perhaps, and a certain unfortunate interest in spiritualist phenomena that may have provided Dr. Caro with useful atmospheric details. The phosphorus, the spirit photographs I kept for my lectures on faith and superstition. I fear they gave him ideas for creating an aura of the supernatural around Mr. Venn's appearances. But I swear before God I was not complicit in any criminal act. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you, though your foolishness nearly made you an accessory. Your parlour games furnished Caro with an atmosphere of possibility. If the curate himself dabbles in spirit manifestations, then who is to say the dead cannot walk? It was a useful piece of misdirection, though unintentionally provided. He returned to the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The cipher to this entire affair lies in understanding what Dr. Caro truly intended. At first, I believe it was merely theft, a temporary borrowing against property he thought could be easily manipulated. But when Mr. Venn proved recalcitrant, when he refused to sign the transfers even under duress, Caro's plans evolved. The nightly appearances in the garden became less frequent. The food grew sparse. The drugging intensified. I believe, Mrs. Venn, that you were being prepared for a final revelation. Your husband's body, discovered in the tunnel, dead of natural causes, or so it would appear. A tragic tale. The poor man, driven mad by some delusion, had secreted himself in an old passage and died there, alone and confused. Who could blame him? The mind sometimes breaks under strain. And who would question too closely, especially with Dr. Caro to sign the death certificate and counsel against autopsy? Mrs. Venn had gone white. You mean to say he would have murdered him? Yes, not with violence. Caro lacks that particular form of courage, but with calculated neglect. Exposure, dehydration, an overdose of chloral disguised as natural decline. The result would have been the same. And you, madam, would have been left not only bereaved but doubting your own sanity. Had you seen a ghost or a living man? Would you ever have known for certain? The psychological torture alone might have rendered you incompetent to manage your own affairs, at which point your stepson, as the male heir, could have acted on your behalf. The collection would have been sold, Caro's debts cleared, and Miles's inheritance secured. He paused, allowing the full horror of the scheme to settle upon them. It was a plan of considerable cunning, requiring patience, nerve, and a willingness to inflict suffering for personal gain. It failed for 3 reasons. First, because Mrs. Venn possessed more courage than Caro anticipated, and came to Baker Street rather than succumbing to despair. Second, because Miles Hartley, whatever his faults, retained sufficient humanity to waver at the crucial moment. And third, because certain physical details, ash and mica, sealing wax and mismatched boot heels, told a story that contradicted the supernatural narrative Caro wished to establish. Dr. Caro had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands. "I am ruined," he said dully. "Utterly ruined." "You are indeed," Holmes agreed without sympathy, "and justly so. Watson, would you be so kind as to send word to the local constabulary? I believe they will find this matter of considerable interest." I moved to do his bidding, but Mrs. Venn's voice stopped me. "Mr. Holmes, what of the body in the grave? The man who was buried in my husband's name?" Who was he? A pauper from the London hospital, Holmes replied. Unclaimed, unidentified, a sad remnant of the city's forgotten souls. He died of natural causes some days before Mr. Venn's supposed death, and his body was procured by Dr. Carrow through contacts at the hospital. I have already taken the liberty of informing the authorities, and arrangements will be made for proper Christian burial under his own name, if it can be discovered, or at least with the dignity he deserves. The deception extended even to the wax mask that was moulded to approximate Mr. Venn's features, a crude job, but sufficient to deceive in a closed coffin when backed by a physician's assurances of contagion. He turned to Alistair Venn. Sir, you have been through an ordeal that would break most men, but you are free now, and your collection is secure. I would recommend that you place those cylinder seals in trust with a reputable institution, the British Museum, perhaps, where they can be studied by scholars and protected from the grasping hands of those who see in antiquity only monetary value. Venn nodded weakly. I shall do so, Mr. Holmes. And I shall never again trust so blindly in those who wear the mask of friendship. A harsh lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. There was more to be done, of course, the constable to be summoned, statements to be taken, the tunnel to be formally examined, and then sealed. Miles Hartley, to his credit, confessed with tears to a scheme that had outrun his bravery and slid into wickedness under a cooler hand. He would face charges of conspiracy and fraud, though his cooperation and evident remorse might mitigate his sentence. Doctor, Carrow turned his hands out to the irons with a composure that surprised me. I think at the last he was relieved to lay down the burden of cleverness that had ruined him. He had played the role of respected physician so long that when he stepped outside it, he found himself in a landscape without landmarks, and his moral compass, never strong, had simply ceased to function. He would be tried and convicted, his medical license revoked, his reputation destroyed, a fall from grace as complete as any I had witnessed. As for the Reverend Pritchard, he was cautioned about the dangers of credulity and sent back to his parish with a recommendation that he confine his experiments to the realm of theology rather than the occult. Brant, it transpired, had known nothing of the plot and maintained her position at Ashfield Lodge, where I have no doubt she continued to rule the household with her customary iron hand. The tunnel itself proved to be a fascinating piece of history, a genuine medieval passage, probably used by priests during the Reformation, that had been expanded and improved by Carrow and Miles over the course of several months. The chamber where Venn had been imprisoned was bricked up, the entrance from the shed sealed, and the heartwood tomb properly repaired and sanctified by the bishop himself, who was profoundly disturbed by its desecration. As for Mr. and Mrs. Venn, they emerged from their trial with a bond strengthened by adversity. He became at once a man more tender with his wife and more stern with himself, understanding perhaps that his absorption in ancient things had made him blind to present dangers. The cylinder seals were indeed donated to the British Museum, where they remain to this day, a testament to his scholarship and his generosity. I confess I liked him the better for his misadventure, for there is something in a man tested by darkness that reveals his true quality, and Venn had proven himself resilient beyond expectation. We took our leave at noon the following day, after all the formal business had been concluded. The fog had lifted, and the winter sun was making a pale gold of every puddle, transforming the sodden landscape into something almost beautiful. Holmes walked with that long, swift stride which he never spared me, his stick swinging, his spirits visibly lifted by the successful resolution of a case that had challenged even his remarkable faculties. "You see, Watson," he said as we made our way to the station, "the supernatural, when properly investigated, invariably resolves into the natural. Ghosts are human inventions, whether of guilt, grief, or greed. In this case, greed, perhaps the most reliable of human motives." "And the medical aspect?" I asked. "The drugging, the false death certificate, surely that required considerable knowledge." "Indeed. Which is why crimes committed by educated men are often more elaborate than those of common thieves. Education provides tools. Morality determines how they are used. Caro had the tools, but lacked the anchor. He drifted into wickedness as a boat without mooring drifts toward rocks, gradually, inevitably, and with increasing speed. We boarded the train and settled into our compartment as the engine built steam. Through the window, I could see Ashfield Lodge in the distance, its chimneys smoking peacefully, its grounds returning to the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. Somewhere in that house, a husband and wife were rebuilding trust. Somewhere in the village, a constable was writing his report. And somewhere in London, a physician's nameplate was being removed from a respected street, never to be replaced. "A successful conclusion," I observed. "A necessary one," Holmes corrected. "Success implies pleasure in the outcome, and I find no pleasure in exposing the corruption of those who should heal rather than harm. But it was necessary, and we have at least restored one innocent man to his life and prevented further evil. That must suffice." The train pulled away from the platform, carrying us back toward London and Baker Street, where other mysteries awaited and other wrongs demanded righting. Behind us, Surrey receded into the distance, its fields and hedgerows resuming their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas that occasionally disturbed their peace. Thus ended a case in which the churchyard lent its silence to a fraud, and the living were disguised more thoroughly than the dead. It would take its place in my chronicles as The Adventure of the Man Who Never Died, a title that captured both the deception and its unraveling, the false death and the true imprisonment, the phantom that proved all too solid, and the crime that masqueraded as miracle. Chapter 5. The Household Assembled. The full accounting came some weeks later, after the trials had concluded and the public appetite for sensation had moved on to fresher scandals. I was again at Baker Street on a grey March morning when Holmes received a letter bearing the Ashfield Lodge seal. He opened it with that mixture of curiosity and caution that characterized his attitude toward concluded cases, interested to know their aftermath, but wary of being drawn into further complications. The letter was from Mrs. Venn, and Holmes read it aloud at my request. "My dear Mr. Holmes, I write to inform you that Alistair and I have quite recovered from our ordeal, and that Ashfield Lodge has returned to something approaching its former peace. My husband asked me to convey his profound gratitude once again for your intervention, which undoubtedly saved his life. The cylinder seals have been transferred to the British Museum, where they have already attracted considerable scholarly interest. My stepson Miles has been sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, reduced from 5 on account of his cooperation and evident remorse. We have made financial provision for his support upon release, though it is understood he will not return to Ashfield. Dr. Carow received 7 years at hard labour for his crimes, a sentence, I confess, brings me more sorrow than satisfaction, for I once considered him a friend to our family. I wished you to know that your work has borne fruit beyond the immediate resolution. My husband and I have established a fund to support the proper burial of unclaimed remains at London Hospital, that no other unfortunate soul might be exploited as that poor man was. We have also endowed a lectureship at the British Museum in Mesopotamian Studies, to be named in honour of scholarly integrity, a quality we have learned not to take for granted. With deepest gratitude and respect, I remain, Eleanor Venn. Holmes folded the letter and laid it aside with an expression of a quiet satisfaction. There, Watson, is the proper conclusion to our affair. Justice served, lessons learned, and even some good drawn from evil. It is more than many cases yield. And the body from the grave? I asked. Did they determine his identity? They did. A clerk named Thomas Enderby, late of Cheapside, who died of consumption after a life of blameless poverty. He has been reburied properly, with his name restored and a headstone purchased by the Venns. Even in death, it seems, a man deserves his true name. We sat in comfortable silence for a time, Holmes smoking and gazing at the ceiling, while I made notes for the chronicle I intended to write. The morning traffic of Baker Street rumbled past our window, costermongers crying their wares, hansom cabs clattering on cobbles, the great human river of London flowing eternally past our door. What strikes me most, I said at length, is the elaborate nature of the deception. To go to such lengths, the tunnel, the substitute body, the staged appearances, it speaks to a mind of considerable cunning. And considerable desperation, Holmes added. Carow's debts were substantial. Gambling losses, I learned later, compounded by investment in fraudulent schemes. He saw in Venn's collection a solution to his difficulties, but lacked the simple brutality to commit outright theft. Instead, he constructed an elaborate mechanism that allowed him to think of himself as borrowing rather than stealing, temporarily inconveniencing rather than imprisoning. The human capacity for self-deception is remarkable, Watson. Carow convinced himself he was acting for the best, even as he drugged a man and left him in darkness. And Miles Hartley? A weak young man led into wickedness by stronger personalities and his own fecklessness. There are thousands like him in London, sons of good families who fritter away their inheritance on cards and horses, who run up debts they cannot pay, who drift into bad company because they lack the moral backbone to resist. In another context, with different influences, he might have lived an unremarkable but blameless life. Instead, he became complicit in a crime that will mark him forever. You have no sympathy for him. Some, Holmes admitted. But sympathy does not excuse actions. He made choices, Watson, and choices have consequences. He chose to trust Carow when his instincts warned him otherwise. He chose to don his stepfather's coat and play the ghost. He chose, night after night, to leave a decent man imprisoned in darkness. Those choices define him now, and it will take many years of better choices to redeem them, if redemption is even possible. He rose and went to the window, looking down at the street with that distant expression that sometimes came over him. Do you know what I find most troubling about this case? Not the mechanics of the deception, which were clever enough, not even the cruelty, which was considerable, but the violation of sacred trusts, A physician who betrays his oath, a stepson who betrays his family, a friend who betrays friendship. These are the foundations upon which society rests, Watson. Trust between patient and healer, between family members, between those who break bread together. When those foundations crack, everything above them becomes unstable. Yet they were caught, I pointed out. Justice was done. This time, yes. But how many Dr. Carrows practice medicine in London today, their betrayals undiscovered? How many Miles Hartleys gamble away their futures in the clubs of St. James? The law can punish those who are caught, but it cannot prevent the first transgression, cannot restore innocence once lost. That is why your chronicles matter, Watson. They serve as cautionary tales, reminders that deception has consequences, and that cleverness without morality leads inevitably to ruin. It was the closest Holmes had ever come to acknowledging the value of my literary efforts, and I confess I was touched by his words. For years I had chronicled his adventures with varying degrees of success, often wondering whether my accounts did justice to his genius. To hear him suggest they served a purpose beyond mere entertainment was gratifying indeed. I shall write this case with particular care, I promised. The Man Who Never Died. It has a certain dramatic quality that should appeal to readers. Write it as you will, Holmes said with a slight smile. Only do not romanticize the criminals overmuch. Carrow was not a tragic figure driven to desperation by circumstance. He was a man who chose comfort over conscience, wealth over integrity. Let your readers understand that clearly. And the supernatural element, the apparent ghost? Explain it thoroughly. Show how every mysterious detail had a rational explanation. The ash, the wax, the mismatched footsteps, the letters in a dead man's hand. Let your readers see that what appears supernatural is almost invariably human in origin, born of human motives and executed by human hands. That lesson alone is worth the telling. The conversation drifted to other matters. A new chemical analysis Holmes was conducting, a monograph he was considering on the classification of tobacco ash, a curious problem that had been brought to his attention involving a missing inheritance and a disputed will. But my mind remained fixed on the case of Alistair Venn, turning over its details like a jeweler examining a stone from multiple angles, searching for the facets that would catch the light most brilliantly when I came to write it. What struck me most forcefully, as I reflected upon it, was the essential loneliness of Venn's imprisonment. To be confined in darkness, uncertain of one's fate, betrayed by those one trusted, it was a nightmare made manifest. And yet he had endured, had maintained his sanity and his moral compass, had refused to sign documents even when drugged and desperate. There was something noble in that resistance, something that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit even under terrible conditions. Mrs. Venn, too, deserved credit. Where another woman might have succumbed to grief or madness, she had sought help, had trusted her instincts, had maintained her composure even while being systematically tormented. The courage required to come to Baker Street, to speak of impossibilities to a stranger, to hold oneself together while one's world dissolved. That was heroism of a quiet but profound sort. You know, I said to Holmes, Mrs. Venn's courage may have been the most crucial element in solving this case. Had she not come to us, Holmes interrupted, Alistair Venn would be dead, Carrow would be wealthy, and Miles Hartley would would be spending his ill-gotten inheritance in the gaming houses of Mayfair. Yes, Watson, her courage was essential. Never underestimate the power of a woman who refuses to accept comfortable lies. They are formidable creatures, and I have found them more reliable than most men when it comes to perceiving truth beneath deception. From Holmes, who rarely praised anyone and spoke of women even less frequently, this was high commendation indeed. The weeks that followed brought occasional updates on the case's aftermath. The tunnel beneath the church was thoroughly explored and mapped, revealing a network of passages far more extensive than anyone had suspected. Medieval priest holes, Civil War escape routes, even what appeared to be remnants of Roman construction, all interwoven beneath the innocent-looking Surrey countryside. The local antiquarian society was ecstatic. The church wardens rather less so, given the expense of properly sealing and securing such a labyrinth. Miles Hartley, we learned, bore his imprisonment with unexpected dignity. He worked in the prison library, taught reading to illiterate inmates, and wrote long letters to his mother expressing remorse and determination to rebuild his character. Whether this represented genuine reformation or mere performance, I could not judge. But Holmes, when I mentioned it to him, merely shrugged. "Time will tell," he said. "Men sometimes emerge from prison better than they entered, though more often they emerge worse. We can only hope young Hartley is among the former. Dr. Carrow's fall was more complete and final. His practice was dissolved, his license revoked permanently, his name struck from the medical register. He would serve his 7 years and emerge middle-aged, broken and unemployable in his profession. It was a harsh fate, but one that Holmes considered appropriate. He violated every principle of his calling, Holmes observed, when I expressed some sympathy for the man. He used his medical knowledge to facilitate crime, his position to gain trust, his authority to silence questions. If we cannot trust our physicians, Watson, if we cannot believe they will heal rather than harm, then one of civilization's fundamental pillars has crumbled. The punishment, though severe, is just. I could not disagree, though I confess I sometimes wondered about Carrow in his cell. What thoughts occupied him, whether he experienced genuine remorse or only regret at being caught. The human heart remains a mystery even to those who study it professionally, and I have learned that the motivations that drive men to evil are often more complex than simple greed or malice. As spring advanced toward summer, the case of the man who never died receded into memory, taking its place among the hundreds of investigations that had occupied our attention over the years. Baker Street received its usual parade of the desperate, the wronged, and the merely curious. Holmes threw himself into new problems with his characteristic intensity, and I resumed my medical practice and my domestic duties. But I did not forget Ashfield Lodge, or the fog-shrouded churchyard, or the moment when we opened that secret door and found a living man where all logic suggested there should be only ancient bones. It remained with me as all the best cases did, not merely as a puzzle solved, but as a reminder of what human beings are capable of, both for evil and for good. For in the end, that is what our chronicles record, not simply crimes and their solutions, but the eternal struggle between those who would deceive and those who would reveal, those who would harm and those who would heal, those who would imprison and those who would set free. Sherlock Holmes stood always on the side of truth, and I counted it my privilege to stand beside him, chronicling his victories not for glory, but for the simple affirmation that reason, courage, and persistence can overcome even the most elaborate deceptions. If ever the phrase, "the man who never died," was spoken with conviction, it was by those who wished Alistair Venn dead indeed, but alive in appearance, a phantom to frighten, a ghost to manipulate, a tool to be used, and then discarded. And in pulling off that mask, in exposing the mechanism behind the miracle, Holmes left us not with spectres, but with men. Flawed, desperate, human men whose crimes required no supernatural explanation, whose motives were all too comprehensible, and whose punishment, though just, carried within it the tragedy of wasted potential and betrayed trust. Thus, I set down this account for the public record, that others might learn from it what we learned. That the dead do not walk, but the living sometimes pretend they do. That trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. That cleverness without conscience leads to ruin, and that even in the darkest tunnels, even in the deepest deceptions, there burns always the possibility of truth discovered and justice done. And if my readers, in some distant year, should find themselves tempted to believe in ghosts and supernatural manifestations, let them remember Ashfield Lodge and ask themselves, what human hand pulls the strings? What human voice speaks from the shadows? What human greed or fear animates the phantom? For in the end we have more to fear from the living than from the dead, and the greatest mysteries are not those that defy explanation, but those that require only patience, observation, and the clear light of reason to resolve. So concludes my account of the adventure of the man who never died, as witnessed and chronicled by John H. Watson, M.D., in the spring of 1895, and set down for publication in the year of our Lord, 1896, that others might benefit from the lessons it contains and the example it provides of justice pursued and truth revealed.